In a desperate plea from behind bars, notorious drug lord El Chapo penned a letter to prison authorities, claiming his treatment was sure, but his complaints would fall on deaf ears. Now, El Chapo isn't the first crime boss to face tough times in prison, and he certainly won't be the last. In the world of organized crime, there's a saying, you can run, but you can't hide. For many cartel members and mob bosses, this rings especially true once they find themselves behind bars. And while a life sentence may seem like the harshest punishment imaginable, for some of these hardened criminals, it's just the beginning of their nightmare. The real hell often starts when the cell door slams shut.
There is such a thing as evil, and some people are evil.
From living like kings to being treated worse than animals, and from ruling empires to begging for basic human rights, this is how cartel members get treated in prison. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela. In the annals of drug trafficking history, few names carry as much weight as Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela. Along with his brother Miguel, Gilberto built an empire like no other, and, at the height of their power, the Cali cartel was bringing in an estimated $8 billion a year. That's more than the GDP of some small countries. But as the saying goes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, and Gilberto was no exception.
The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration has put Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez on the top of their most wanted list.
In 1995, Colombian authorities finally caught up with him, and in a scene that could have been ripped from a Hollywood movie, they found him hiding in a secret compartment behind a bookcase in his Cali apartment. It was a humiliating end for a man who once controlled most of the world's cocaine trade. But Gilberto's story was far from over. After serving just 7 years of a 15-year sentence in Colombia, he was released due to a controversial court ruling. Now, for a while, it seemed like Gilberto had outmaneuvered the system once again. The U.S. government, however, had other plans. In 2004, Gilberto was extradited to the United States. This wasn't just any extradition, it was a major diplomatic event. The Colombian president at the time, Álvaro Uribe, personally announced it on national television. That's how big a deal Gilberto was. But now that he was finally on US, Gilberto faced a laundry list of charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, as well as obstruction of justice. Then, in September 2006, at the tender age of 67, he was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison in what seemed like the final chapter in the story of one of the world's most powerful lords. But life in a U.S. federal prison wasn't easy for a man who once lived like a king, and Gilberto's health began to deteriorate rapidly.
Es usted muy gentil en atendernos. ¿Cómo siguió? ¿Cómo va su corazón?
Pues físicamente un poquito maltratado,
Sí.
pero espiritualmente bien, ¿sabe?
He suffered from a lot of serious illnesses, including prostate and colon cancer, and his lawyers repeatedly petitioned for his early release on compassionate grounds, arguing that the prison conditions were contributing to his deteriorating state. But the U.S. justice system wasn't swayed. Despite his declining health, Gilberto's crimes were still considered way too severe for any leniency. The man who once controlled most of the world's cocaine trade was now just another inmate stuck in the federal prison system. And, as fate would have it, Gilberto's situation dragged on for years, while his requests for freedom fell on deaf ears again and again. Then finally, on May 31st, 2022, at the age of 83, Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela died at a prison medical center in Butner, North Carolina, and his lawyers, who, by that point, were Gilberto's only remaining connection to the outside world, kept it pretty short and sweet in their official statement. In the end, even the man who's been dubbed the chess player couldn't outmaneuver fate. Gilberto's story proves that in the world of crime, there's only one inevitable outcome, and that's a lonely prison cell. El Chapo. While Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela's story was nearing its end in a prison medical center, another infamous cartel leader was just beginning his journey through the U.S. prison system. We're of course talking about Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Now, El Chapo is a man who needs no introduction. After all, he gained near-mythical status thanks to his many prison escapes in Mexico.
These are the last images of Guzman before he makes the most daring escape in recent history. At one point, he appears to bend forward, focusing on something in the floor of the shower. Then, he sits down, appearing to remove his sandals. And then, he vanishes.
But in the United States, he would find that escaping was no longer on the menu. U.S. authorities were determined not to make the same mistakes that once allowed El Chapo to break free not once, but 2 different times.
The El Chapo escape fears are not unfounded. He tunneled out of the last Mexican prison where he was locked up and rode to freedom on an underground motorcycle. That was his second escape.
When El Chapo was extradited to the United States in 2017, he was sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, or MCC for short, one of the most secure facilities in the country. The conditions at MCC New York were a far cry from the relative comfort El Chapo had enjoyed in Mexican prisons. He was kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour for exercise in a small cage-like room. The temperature in his cell was kept uncomfortably cold, and the lights were on 24 hours a day, making it extremely difficult for him to even sleep. Now, of course, El Chapo's lawyers complained bitterly about these conditions. They argued that the harsh treatment was unnecessary and amounted to torture.
Tonight, the I-Team has a letter from El Chapo in which he implies that U.S. prison officials are bullying him because he has escaped before.
But the authorities were unmoved. They knew exactly who they were dealing with and were taking no chances. After his conviction in 2019, El Chapo was then sentenced to life plus 30 years and transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, a prison that's often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, and it didn't gain this nickname by not rising to the occasion either. This supermax prison is designed to hold the most dangerous criminals in the U.S. prison system, and it's considered completely unescapable, and it was in this place that El Chapo's world shrank even further. His cell, measuring 7 by 12 feet, contains a concrete bed, a concrete desk, and a concrete stool. That's all. He does have a small window, but it's designed so that he can only see the sky, never really knowing where he is within the prison complex. Speaking of which, the isolation is near total. El Chapo spends 23 hours a day in his cell, with 1 hour for exercise in a slightly larger concrete box. He has almost no human contact, with meals delivered through a slot in the door. Even his rare meetings with lawyers are conducted through an indestructible plexiglass barrier. Now, for a man who once commanded an empire and lived a life of luxury, this existence is a stark and brutal change. El Chapo has complained about the conditions, calling them torture, and claiming they're affecting his physical and mental health. Guzman made a rare public statement at his sentencing, chastising authorities for conditions at New York's Metropolitan Correctional Center that he equated with torture. He said he was denied access to sunlight and forced to drink unsanitary water. He said he had to use wadded-up toilet paper as earplugs to sleep amid noise from an air vent near his cell. But for the authorities, and for many of El Chapo's victims, these complaints fall on deaf ears. As DEA Special Agent Ray Donovan put it, "This is the kind of fate that a man responsible for unspeakable violence and death deserves. Thousands of people died or were ordered killed because of the Sinaloa cartel. So yeah, he doesn't leave his cell. It is boring. It's monotonous. It is very sad, but here's the difference. He's alive, and that means he could do plenty of things, unlike many of his victims." El Chapo's story reminds everyone that even the most powerful criminals can be brought low. The man who once escaped from prison through tunnels and bribes now finds himself in a place where escape is impossible, and where his every move is watched and controlled. But El Chapo's treatment in prison isn't just about punishment or preventing escape. It's also about sending a message to other cartel leaders and would-be criminals, and that message is clear. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you have, the law will eventually catch up with you, and when it does, all your power and wealth will mean nothing. James Whitey Bulger. We've seen how El Chapo faces isolation and how Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela met a slow decline, but some crime bosses face an even more brutal fate behind bars. Let's talk about James Whitey Bulger, a man whose story proves that sometimes prison itself can be a death sentence. Born in 1929, Bulger came up in a tough neighborhood during the Great Depression. He got his start in crime early, working his way up from petty theft to armed robbery and truck hijacking. But Bulger wasn't content with being a small-time crook. He had big ambitions, and he was smart enough and ruthless enough to make them happen. By the 1970s, Bulger had become one of the most powerful gangsters in Boston. He controlled rackets ranging from loan sharking to trafficking, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to keep his grip on power. But what made Bulger really stand out was his relationship with the FBI. You see, Bulger wasn't just a gangster, he was also an FBI informant. For years, he fed the feds information about his rivals, particularly the Italian mafia. In return, his FBI handler, John Connolly, tipped him off about investigations and essentially gave him a free pass to run his criminal empire. One former law enforcement official even mentioned that he was straight up terrified of him.
He was the scariest criminal I ever came across. You could see it in his eyes. He just had that stare in his eyes, 1,000-yard look. He was just ruthless. He was just ruthless.
This alliance between Bulger and the FBI went on for years, with Whitey becoming more and more powerful. He was involved in all sorts of crimes, including at least 11 murders. But because of his deal with the FBI, he seemed pretty much untouchable. He walked around South Boston like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did.
They just knew they had the bases covered. And in the end, they thought they'd always hold that ace, that they were informants for the FBI.
But here's the thing about playing both sides. Eventually, it catches up with you. In 1994, Bulger got word that he was about to be indicted, so he did what any self-respecting gangster would do. He went on the run. For 16 years, Bulger was one of America's most wanted fugitives. He was right up there with Osama bin Laden on the FBI's most wanted list. While he was on the run, Bulger's legend only grew. There were sightings reported all over the world. Some people thought he was in Europe. Others swore they'd seen him in South America. All the while, the FBI was chasing leads and coming up empty-handed. But in 2011, the law finally caught up with him. Bulger, then 81 years old, was arrested in Santa Monica, California, where he'd been living under an assumed name. He'd been hiding in plain sight all along, living in a nice apartment with his longtime girlfriend.
It's a day the FBI and many victims' family members never thought they would see. James Whitey Bulger will begin the sentencing phase tomorrow in federal court. The former leader of Boston's notorious Winter Hill gang will soon learn whether he'll spend the rest of his life locked up after being convicted of racketeering and murder charges.
Bulger's rap sheet was a mile long and getting longer by the minute. Racketeering, money laundering, extortion, you name it, Whitey had done it. But the real kicker? His involvement in 11 murders. When the judge finally got his hands on Bulger, he didn't just throw the book at him. He hurled the entire library, 2 life terms plus 5 years, just to make sure. It seemed like justice had finally caught up with the notorious Boston gangster. Case closed, right? Time for Whitey to fade into obscurity behind bars. But if you thought that was the end of Bulger's story, you'd be dead wrong. And I mean that quite literally. Fast forward to October 2018. Bulger, now a frail 89-year-old, gets transferred to the United States Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia. Now, let's paint you a picture of Hazleton. They don't call it Misery Mountain for nothing. This place is the Thunderdome of the federal prison system. Violent, unforgiving, and not exactly a retirement home for elderly gangsters. For a man with Bulger's history of ratting out fellow criminals, it was like being tossed into a shark tank with a neon sign reading snitch hanging around his neck. Bulger didn't even have time to unpack.
The criminal turned FBI informant who was captured after 16 years on the run was found dead this morning in a federal prison in West Virginia.
Within 12 hours of arrival, he was found in his cell, or what was left of him anyway. He had been beaten to death with a sock filled with padlocks, but his killers didn't stop there. In a final act of brutality, they'd attempted to gouge out his eyes and slice off his tongue. It was a grisly end that seemed almost poetic in its savagery. A man who'd spent his life dealing in violence, meeting an unimaginably violent end. The very system that Bulger had manipulated for decades, playing the FBI against his criminal rivals, had ultimately failed to protect him. In the end, his past caught up with him in the most violent way possible, or, as one local resident put it, after hearing of Bulger's death.
I'm surprised it took that long, to be honest with you.
And why do you say that?
You ratted out a lot of people. I'm surprised it wasn't early, that's all.
Bulger's story is a perfect example of how a life of crime eventually comes full circle. He might have thought he was untouchable, but in the end, he died alone in a prison cell, murdered by the very kind of men he'd spent his life controlling and betraying.
Here's what it is, I guess. You usually get what you get coming to you, you know?
Michael Torres. Just when you thought you'd heard it all, along comes a story that makes Whitey Bulger's demise look tamer by comparison. Meet Michael Torres, aka The Fly, a man who learned the hard way that even in prison, there's always a bigger predator. Now, Torres wasn't your average street thug. He was actually a big shot in the Mexican Mafia, one of America's most feared prison gangs. We're talking about an organization so powerful, it could make hardened criminals quake in their boots.
The members of the Mexican Mafia were somebody that we had all heard of throughout our time. You know, as juveniles, as kids, we looked up to these guys.
Torres's criminal career started in the San Fernando Valley, where he quickly made a name for himself with the San Fer Gang. But it was in 1994, while doing time in Pelican Bay State Prison, that Torres hit the big leagues. He was inducted into the Mexican Mafia. Imagine that, getting a promotion while you're in prison. After serving a 16-year stretch for manslaughter, Torres walked out of prison in the early 2000s. But instead of going straight, he doubled down down on his life of crime. He became the Mexican Mafia's sanctioned tax collector in San Fernando Valley. Every criminal in the area had to pay Torres a cut of their earnings, and if you didn't pay, well, let's just say Torres wasn't known for his gentle reminders. In 2003, Torres showed just how ruthless he could be. He personally executed a guy named David Diablo Mendoza. The crime? Mendoza had claimed Mexican Mafia membership without authorization. In Torres's world, that was a capital offense. But here's where things get really interesting. Torres eventually got caught and sent back to prison with a life sentence. Game over, right? Not for the fly, because even behind bars, Torres kept his criminal empire buzzing. He used smuggled cell phones to stay in touch with his underlings, demanding detailed financial reports like some kind of twisted CEO. From his cell, Torres ran two main rackets: the Kitty, a collection and resale of Latino inmates' commissary items, and a 1/3 tax on all jail sales. The guy was pocketing thousands every week while supposedly serving time. He even expanded his operation, taxing gangs and drug dealers in San Fernando and Antelope Valleys, and investing the profits in legitimate ventures and real estate. A regular Warren Buffett of the underworld. But here's the thing about being on top in the criminal world. There's always someone gunning for your position. And on July 6, 2023, Torres's luck finally ran out.
The California State Prison is investigating the stabbing death of an inmate. Torres had been serving a 133-year sentence for a list of crimes, including attempted murder, and was a third-strike offender.
Two inmates at California State Prison, Sacramento, decided it was time for Torres to check out permanently. They ambushed him and stabbed him to death. And here's the kicker. One of the attackers, Ray Martinez, was also a Mexican Mafia member. This wasn't just a prison fight, it was a gangland execution.
When it comes down to it, you become a liability. Why? Because you know too much. So what they'll do to cover their asses, they'll eliminate you. If you go back into history, 99% of the victims of the Mexican Mafia have been their own members.
Torres's downfall proves that even at the top of the criminal food chain, you're never safe. The very organization that gave him power ultimately sealed his fate. In the end, all his schemes, all his power plays, all his wealth, none of it could save him from a shiv in a prison yard. And that's because, in the world of organized crime, there's really no such thing as loyalty or friendship. The guy watching your back today might be the one sticking a knife in it tomorrow. Torres spent his life building a criminal empire, only to die alone in a prison cell, betrayed by one of his own. In the criminal underworld, you might fly high for a while, but sooner or later, every single fly gets swatted. From Gilberto's slow decline to James Bulger's brutal murder, from Michael Torres's betrayal to El Chapo's isolation, these stories reveal the harrowing reality awaiting cartel members and mob bosses in prison. The power, wealth, and influence they once enjoyed become meaningless behind bars. In the end, crime doesn't pay, it only takes. Whether it's a lonely death, a violent end, or a life in solitary confinement, the price is always steep. Is any amount of power or money ever worth such a fate? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if these stories of rise and fall fascinated you, hit that subscribe button for more shocking tales from the criminal underworld. Until next time, stay safe.